A new report from Canadian real estate company Zoocasa is suggesting that immigration is the problem when it comes to housing affordability in Canada. But is that actually the case? And is Zoocasa's research valid, or is it just another poor data point in the narrative that immigration is the real estate problem? Which, by the way, it isn't. But before I get into all the details, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. And don't forget, you can still get my new book, Mortgage Secrets, by going to mortgagesecrets.ca completely for free. All you have to do is pay the shipping and handling. Okay, so a new report is suggesting that Canadian population growth is the problem when it comes to real estate prices. And while it may be a part of the problem, the reality here is that it is not the problem in its entirety. In fact, it probably isn't even the real problem. And I'm going to dig into the headlines and the actual data here and show you exactly what's going on and why this report is probably actually just a false narrative that really isn't doing anybody any favors, especially Zoocasa. When they release reports like this, they should really, if they haven't already, and I'm guessing they haven't based on the ridiculousness of this data, run this by an economist to make sure that the data they are presenting is valid and actually forms some basis of truth. So I'm going to jump you in. I'm going to show you the headline. This is from Bean and Bloomberg. Canadian population growth to drive home prices higher and faster report. So there's some interesting parts of this headline here. The expected rise in Canada's population is likely to make the country's limited housing supply worse and ultimately lead to even higher home prices. Yes, this is partially true. Yes, having a bigger population without proper supply of housing is definitely going to lead to higher prices. But to me, right out of the gate, this seems like a puff piece that is designed to create the perception that housing prices aren't going to go down anytime soon. And of course, as you all know, trying to predict whether or not housing prices will go up or down or sideways is a fool's errand. It's not something that is easy to do over the short term. Over the long term, yes. Then it goes on to say that the data showed that 2022 was a record-breaking year for the country's housing market and immigration numbers. Now I'm going to show you the actual housing market and immigration numbers in a second from the actual Zoocasa report that nullifies this argument. Yes, that's right. The data that negates their very own report is in their report. The government welcomed the largest number of immigrants in a single year, 2022, according to immigration. Now, wait until we get to the report where it shows exactly how much home prices went up or down in that year. And at the same time, the national home price soared up to a monthly high of $804,900, a 31% increase from 2021. So far, 2023 has not shown a similar trend. The reason for this is quite simple. It is because while immigration may be a small part of a bigger picture when it comes to housing prices, it is not the straw that is breaking the camel's back here. But then they went on to suggest that the decline is likely to only be temporary. They looked at the 2008-2009 financial crisis. The largest drop in the national average home price in the past 18 years was in 2009, when the price went from $320,000 in January 2008 to $296,000 in January 2009, a 7.6% decline due to the Great Recession, which began in Canada in 2008. It only took a year for the price to recover, and from 2010 to 2018, prices continuously climbed. Then they go on to say, while overall population growth aids economic activity, the problem of where to house more people still remains. So this whole thing just paints this negative picture around immigration, which is a very dangerous game to play. Because first, immigration is so important to economy, especially an economy like Canada's. It adds to the labor force, which adds to productivity, which adds to GDP growth, which makes wages higher and makes life better for everybody, not just the immigrants, but the people who already live in Canada. Immigration, without a doubt, is something that is positive for an economy. It is not negative. And the problem here is that if you create a false narrative around immigration being bad for housing, bad, it can lead to changes that slow down immigration and subsequently hurt the economy overall. And I'm going to venture to guess that most Canadians would rather have slightly higher housing prices than an economy that is completely doomed. And I can't stress this enough, immigration helps support an economy. The problems associated with not having it are far worse than the problems associated with slightly higher housing prices. But I want to take you in and I want to show you the actual data from Zoocasa. This is their actual report, and there's some really interesting things to note here. So first, they've created this really cool graph that shows annual population growth versus national home price. Now, when you graph two things together like this, what it does is it creates the perception that these are either correlated or causal, which I think the graph shows that neither of those two things is the case. Because if they were correlated, the lines would move in unison, not independently. And if they had a causal relationship, so in other words, one thing caused the other, then you would see a spike in one before you saw a spike in the other. And as you can see, population growth has actually been fairly steady over the last 20 years. It has been increasing. It has been increasing at a steady rate, but it has not been increasing at a rate that would suggest that it is causing housing prices to go up as substantially as they have. And we know this, right? The reason we know this is because during the pandemic, there was a significant preference change for housing, which we know caused a significant uptick in a lot of housing markets. Now, what's even more interesting is that the Zoocasa data, their very own data, actually negates their hypothesis. And like I said, this is where it gets really, really interesting. If you take a look at the increase in population in 2020, you can see that housing prices went up by 2.2%. The increase in 2020 was 1.6%. In 2021, the increase in population was 0.3%, and we saw this massive jump of 14.8% in the housing values. Now you might say, well, that 14.8% jump is the cause of the 1.6% rise in immigration in 2020, but it's not. Because if it were causal, the previous year in 2019, where there was a 1.4% increase in population, should have had a similar effect on the 2020 home prices. And if you need further evidence, go back to 2012, where there was a 3.1% increase in immigration and then only a 0.9% increase in housing values the following year. So right here in their very own data, it is clear that immigration is not the cause of higher housing prices. And let's assume for a second that the increase in population affected the same year growth in housing prices. Well, 1.2% does not lead to a 31% increase in housing prices. We see this from 2020, and 3.9%, an even higher year for immigration, doesn't lead to a negative 5.5% increase in housing prices. So Zoocasa's very own data completely dismisses any idea that population growth is the cause of higher housing prices in Canada. It is a small piece of it, but it is not the cause. So then the question is, what is the cause? Well, a lot of it has to do with housing supply. A lot of it also has to do with interest rates. A lot of the increases to housing prices that you've seen over the last 20 years have a lot to do with the fact that interest rates have been at historical lows. And when interest rates are at historical lows, borrowing costs go down, which means the amount of house that people can afford goes up substantially. And there's no clearer indicator of this than what happened in 2020 and 2021, when interest rates went from 3% down to pretty much 1% overnight. So it is actually the interest rates that have led to the higher housing prices. And this has been pretty much consistent since 2008. So then what's the real problem here? The real problem here is not immigration, it's housing completions relative to population growth. And unfortunately, housing completions have actually been on the decline going back to 1971 and 1972. So in an era where we needed more housing because there was more population growth, we've actually seen a decline in the number of houses that are being built. And the question is, what is the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is quite simply this: politics. It's the not in my backyard mentality that has taken over municipal politics and provincial politics. In other words, it's become harder and harder to build houses as small cities, which typically, by the way, have a more leftist leaning, do everything that they can in order to both reap every single penny they can out of home builders and also maintain the quality of life for existing citizens. In other words, the voting base. And this has made it both harder for builders to go and find properties that they can redesignate into more density, and also has made it exceedingly expensive for builders to actually build properties. When you have to spend a significant amount of money on the development process, dealing with councils, and then paying taxes and permitting costs, it has made building and developing simply not worthwhile for corporations. And because the profit margins have shrunk and it's gotten significantly harder, less people want to do it. When less people want to build houses, that reduces the housing supply, and then the houses that are required in order to house the growing population just simply aren't there. So the moral of the story is this: the Canadian housing price issue is a homegrown problem, and it starts with the not in my backyard mentality and it becoming increasingly more difficult to actually build new houses. And that's the thing that needs to change. It's not an immigration problem, and articles and reports like the one released by Zoocasa are both absolutely absurd and create a narrative that is both simply not true and completely reckless. Oh, and if you want to see more about what's actually going on in Canadian real estate, make sure you check out one of these videos right here.